Good morning, everybody. I think that we're going to get started just in the sake of time and respecting everybody's busy schedules. My name is Natasha Rollings, and I work here at the FCG Refugee Center. And here we've been so thrilled to share space with Steve Mahar, our wonderful guest speaker for today. It was just a joy to continue learning with him and from him. We're really excited to have this session today where we're going to be able to learn from Steve's experience in leading this work. Steve brings tremendous expertise informed by his many years in frontline service, where he's been able to identify gaps in the sector, and he's really working to fill those gaps by providing necessary support for vulnerable children. Steve really does have extensive experience working in the settlement sector for many, many years, and he's been dreaming of bringing this initiative, the Center for Refugee Children, to life. Steve and the center are building upon this vision of supporting unaccompanied minors and all migrant children. And we're just so excited to learn from him today and sharing this experience. So welcome, Steve.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction. I'd like to thank Natasha and Carolina and the whole team at FCJ for inviting me to this virtual space today to be able to discuss with all of you a little bit about working with refugee and migrant children. It's certainly, I am far from the only expert on this topic, and I'm sure that there are many of you in attendance who have expertise in different areas of settlement and refugee protection, working with refugee children. So I'd just like to acknowledge that certainly there are people in attendance who have far more expertise in certain areas than I do, but I hope that this webinar is worthwhile for everyone as we start to think about how to better serve refugee and migrant children in the work we're doing, whether that's settlement, whether that's child welfare, education. I'm sure there's some students in attendance as well who are looking to learn and build up their knowledge. So hopefully there's something in this webinar for everyone that's worthwhile. So just as a bit of a background, building on what Natasha said, I am working as project director at the Center for Refugee Children. It is a brand new initiative that we launched earlier this year to provide direct settlement services to unaccompanied and separated children in Ontario. We do have a specialized focus at the center on working with refugee and migrant children who are navigating the refugee claim process and other immigration proceedings, and to work with unaccompanied and separated children who are residing in Ontario, which we'll talk a little bit more about today. In addition to the services that we're developing and providing, we're also focused on providing some public education and advocacy initiatives in response to the issues that impact unaccompanied and separated children in Ontario and throughout Canada. Oh, great. And I can see that the video is kicked in, so that's great. Nice to connect that way as well. So you'll see here that if you want to get in touch with the Center for Refugee Children, either to schedule an appointment, make a referral, or set up a presentation, you can always contact us by phone or email, and we'll make sure that this information is available at the end of the presentation as well. So just a few details on the webinar, just so everyone is aware. The webinar is being recorded. The recording and the slides that we are going through today will be made available on FCJ's website. So there will be access to all of the materials from today's presentation. Questions can be posted in the Q&A and chat features during the webinar, and we'll aim to have some time to respond to questions following the presentation. So if there are questions that come up during the presentation, please feel free to post them in the Q&A or the chat functions. And at the end of the presentation, we will go through them and hopefully be able to have a bit of a discussion and respond to those inquiries. So one of the things I'm really excited about with this presentation today is we've actually broken it into two parts. So this is part one today, and part two is next week, Wednesday. And why I'm really happy about that is because breaking this workshop or this presentation into two parts, it allows us to separate the talk into context and approach, which we're going to talk about today, and then the specific legal and settlement needs and priorities for working with refugee and migrant children, which we're going to talk about more next week. And the reason I'm really excited about that is because I think often when we talk about issues impacting refugee and migrant children, we're so focused as service providers and as advocates and as support networks on the specific issues and challenges and cases, is that oftentimes the context and our approach to the work gets overlooked, or maybe we don't give that enough of a focus. And I really think it is helpful to take a step back and to look at things from the big picture, because it will help inform how we approach our work with refugee and migrant children. And hopefully it will allow us to do the work a little bit better. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And you can see the topics that we're hoping to touch on during today's presentation. So let's start with what for many of you would be very basic. When we talk about refugee migrant children, the first thing to discuss is who are children? Who are children that we're talking about? And so a child, when we talk about refugee and migrant children, we're talking about anyone under the age of 18. And I think that that is important because in practice, when you're working with children and youth, sometimes we tend to think as the older children, the 15, 16, 17-year-olds, as youth and not as children. And very similarly, many of them will not identify as children, but will identify as youth. And I think that makes total sense in practice. But I think when we're talking about refugee and migrant children and the context, we want to make sure that we're including everyone under the age of 18. And that's important because there are immigration and legal differences that come up when someone is under 18. And it's also important because it connects all children under 18 with the rights and opportunities outlined in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which we'll talk about as well. So going forward, whenever you hear refugee and migrant children, just keep in mind that we're talking about everyone under the age of 18, okay? So we're talking about unaccompanied and separated children, and this presentation will go back and forth. Sometimes we'll talk specifically about unaccompanied and separated children, and sometimes we will talk about refugee and migrant children, which will also include accompanied children who are here with their parents or a caregiver. But I think it's important to define unaccompanied and separated children. So when we talk about an unaccompanied child, in very basic terms, we're talking about a refugee or a migrant child who is in Canada alone without their parents or a legal guardian, okay? So this is a child under 18 who is here without their parent, okay? They've often arrived without their parents or a legal guardian, and they're navigating their settlement on their own, alone. There's another group, separated children, which we think it's really important to distinguish and to include when we talk about unaccompanied and separated children. And these are children who are in Canada without their parents or a legal guardian, but they may not be alone. And that's the big difference between an unaccompanied child and a separated child. Separated children may be living under the care of another family member, relative, or caregiver. And we see that a lot. We see many children and youth who may be living with a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle or an adult age sibling, but they are not with their parent or legal guardian. And in that sense, we consider them separated. And I think it's very important when we talk about unaccompanied and separated children that we also capture children in that category. Because if we narrow the definition to unaccompanied children, we're leaving out a lot of children who, even though they're with family members or a caregiver, may be going through immigration processes and other proceedings on their own. So I think it's really important that we try not to narrow the definition and that we include unaccompanied and separated children together so we capture the different circumstances that these children may find themselves in. So here's some facts and figures, and we post this not so that we can memorize all of the stats that always come out from UNICEF and UNHCR, but we post this more so that we can start to understand that when we talk about migration and when we talk about issues pertaining to refugee and migrant populations, we really are talking about children. Children make up a significant portion of refugee and migrant populations across the world. And I think that's often, we overlook it. We tend to sometimes think of refugee and migrant issues as refugee and migrant issues, and we don't really take a child-focused or a child-centered approach to that work. And I think we need to. And these stats just back that up, just by showing what a significant percentage of refugees and migrants across the world are children, right? And I won't go through all the stats in detail, but I will say that even, I believe last week, UNHCR released their up-to-date 2020 global trends, which has updated numbers on how many children are refugees and migrants in different situations across the world. So we just put this up here just to kind of remind us that when we are working with refugee and migrant populations, we really do need to take a child-focused approach because so many refugee and migrants in Canada and in other regions across the world are children. So what we want to do here, if our technology allows it, is I'm gonna pause and step away and play a video just to give a better perspective on kind of child migration in general and some of the push and pull factors that drive child migration. So if I can, I'm going to try to play a video and I'll step away for a moment. And then after the video's back, we'll continue with the presentation.
Children migrate for a whole host of reasons, probably no fewer or broader than adults. And children have always migrated. I think children have migrated primarily with their families, but for centuries they've also migrated alone. And I think the reasons usually are complicated and multifaceted. We've spent a lot of time categorizing the reasons why people, including children, move into discrete boxes. But in fact, I think most children move for many reasons at the same time.
Children migrate by themselves a lot of time, even if we don't recognize them. Sometimes migrates because their parents already migrated before, or sometimes migrate because the family is migrating. So those are the three things how they migrate. Why they migrate? Sometimes because that's the only thing they can do. And sometimes because it's the best thing they can do. Very seldom because it's the wrong thing to do. And this is what drives them around the world.
Well, children leave home and migrate for a whole host of reasons. Sometimes there's a huge push factor, isn't there? When there's a civil war, when there's a repressive government, But there's also quite different reasons where young people are looking to get on in the world. And on occasion, it's really a wise decision for them to leave home as young as 12, 13, because if they stay at home or stay living with their family, they're going to be fast-tracked into an immovable situation. For example, a 12 or 13-year-old girl is going to be married off. She's going to be pregnant at 14. So lots of positive reasons as well as negative reasons for leaving home. And of course, there's good outcomes and bad outcomes. And when you talk to migrants of any age, it's very clear that some have a great time and some don't. Some have a terrible time. They're trafficked, they're exploited, and they're abused.
It can be that they are victims of trafficking and that they are being forcibly taken from their homes. It's possible either by family members or relatives or others involved in criminal organisations. Again, it's a complex question and it depends very much on the local context. But in any case, children are often the victims of exploitation. It may be that for very good reasons their family decided that they should be sent away and out of danger and have paid for an agent to traffic them to a safe destination, but along the route they get picked up by other adults and exploited, and that is a problem because no one really is intervening at key points along these migration routes to identify these children.
The common drivers that are discussed for the outmigration of children from Central America are violence, poverty, and family connections. Central America, and especially the three countries that make up the Northern Triangle, so Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, these are among the most violent countries on earth. So extremely high rates of violence, a lot of gang violence, but also domestic violence. Regarding poverty, the area in the Northern Triangle is largely poor. Youth unemployment is high, in part double as high as adult employment. And you have a lot of what's called ninis, youth and young adults that neither work nor study. So there's essentially no future that these children see for themselves or that their parents see for their children. So they decide to send them north. But the other important driver that I wanted to point out are family connections. We've seen in survey after survey that a lot of the children that migrated from Central America to the United States, one of their main drivers was that they had a parent in the United States. Oftentimes, these parents are in the United States not in documented status. And in many cases, these children had not seen their parents in many years.
Many of the crises are multifactorial. So if we just take what's happening in Syria, many people suggest that it is climate change and in particular drought that forced the quite substantial movements of some populations from eastern into western Syria, which really precipitated some of the conflict that we're now seeing, the sectarian conflict that we're now seeing in the country. So climate change certainly factors into population instability and therefore into conflict over scarce resources, and I think this is a phenomenon we're seeing elsewhere too, of course, with rising seawater and so populations being forced to flee from small nation islands and so on. I think another factor which is not related to sort of hot conflict, if you like, is really deeply entrenched discrimination, which could be ethnic or religious or a mixture of both. And we've done quite a lot of work on the Rohingya issue. That's a really extreme example of persistent endemic discrimination against a minority group that's gone on for decades. And so the Rohingya population in Myanmar, but also increasingly now the Rohingya population in Bangladesh, are obliged just to flee in order to find some mechanism for survival because life is intolerable.
Despite the fact that migrant children, for example, are stigmatized, for example, in Europe, so compared with the European children, their life is worse. What you have to think about is to compare with the children back home. This is why people migrated. And if your life is better than their children, then still migrating makes sense. The positive elements are many in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of access to services. The emotional and the psychological one sometimes is difficult, but also in the case of children who are migrating with their parents, the alternative is to stay back home alone. So when parents take a decision to move, usually the same decision is taken the same way everywhere in the world, in a kitchen with your wife and the kids, and deciding we go or we don't. It's the same that Jewish people took during the 40s, when Italians took in the 20s. All the migrants at the end, they have this night when they say, okay, we go. And what they do is always make this comparison. Will be my life better here or going away? Will be better for my kids to stay here and I go, or is it better we stay together? That's the thing. It's very simple. And at the end is looking at the reality, the information I have. Most of them, despite the troubles and the problems, they do make it right. Staying back home was the worst things to do.
Okay, and hopefully we're back, and hopefully the video gives some important context on the issue of child migration and some of the push and pull factors that that drive children to migrate, either with their families or on their own as unaccompanied or separated children. And here's just a recap of what was in the video. We won't go into it into too much detail, but I think, you see that when you're talking about child migration, there are certainly push factors that will force children and their families to flee, whether that's war and conflict, different forms of violence, climate or environmental factors that create population instability, or persecution and discrimination. And there are also pull factors that contribute to when children or families will leave and where they go, right? Safety and stability, family reunification, which could be a huge one for unaccompanied and separated children, better future and opportunities, and also the realization of social and economic rights that they may not be afforded where they're currently living. And I think the big point to emphasize here is that in most cases, it's a combination of push and pull factors that will lead to children or families deciding to migrate. And that could be based on a regional context, but also individual circumstances play a role in deciding when children migrate. So we want to talk quickly about the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And for those of you who don't know, this is a human rights treaty, which sets out political, economic, social, health, and cultural rights of children. It's, I believe, to date, the most adopted and ratified human rights treaty in the world. It was ratified by Canada in 1991, and it sets out the rights that should be afforded to children everywhere, including in Canada, regardless of immigration status, which is really the point that we want to emphasize here. So among the rights, the child's right to life, the child's right to protection from harm, the child's right to express their own opinion and to participate in decision-making, and the child's right to have decisions affecting them be made in their best interest. There are also a lot of social and economic rights, the child's right to food, to safe housing, to income security. These are all embedded in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And again, this is something that's been adopted by Canada. So something that we look to hopefully guide our domestic response within the country when we're working with children. The challenge, or the other side of that, is when we look at refugee and migrant children, unfortunately, sometimes what we see in reality is immigration status is used as something that pulls them away from those rights that are within the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I think a really interesting way to look at that issue is, are we creating a form of statelessness for refugee and migrant children? Certainly, most refugee and migrant children in Canada, they're not legally stateless. They have a nationality, but because the status where they are residing now, whether it's in Canada or another country, is not regularized, they have temporary or undocumented or precarious status, it creates a form of de facto statelessness, wherein their access to services, opportunities, and rights can be limited. And I think we see this a lot when we work with refugee and migrant children in Ontario and throughout Canada, is sometimes their immigration status creates barriers for them to access the services and supports that other children are being afforded. And that's important, I think, for us to remember, because when we go back to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which Canada has adopted and ratified, it very clearly states that all children should have these rights, regardless of things like immigration status. But in reality, we don't always see that. The other point I want to make about immigration status for refugee and migrant children being a barrier to accessing rights and opportunities is sometimes what we see is it's not just the immigration status of the child that creates barriers, but sometimes it's the immigration status of the parents. Even in situations where the children are themselves Canadian, it leads to different barriers. You know, we work with a lot of mixed status families in the sector, and certainly at FCJ, they work with a lot of mixed status families where a common dynamic will be the parents may be undocumented or have precarious immigration status, but the child or the children are Canadian citizens. They were born in Canada. Even in those situations, though, we see that the immigration status of the parents pulls children away from those rights and those opportunities that they should be afforded. And the parents' immigration status can actually prevent or deter the family from accessing services and supports for the child. A really common example of that is access to the Canada Child Benefit, right? We work with many families who, even if the children are Canadian citizens or if they themselves do not have regularized status, if the parents don't have regularized immigration status, children cannot access the Canada Child Benefit, and families are not afforded access to that support. So that's one example. Another example could be social assistance programs through the province, right? Where immigration status, again, is an eligibility criteria that sometimes prevents families and children from accessing critical supports that they need. So let's move to talk for a few minutes on unaccompanied and separated children specifically. And I think the first thing to acknowledge when we talk about unaccompanied and separated children is when we think of unaccompanied and separated children, almost no one thinks of Canada, right? We think of situations like the United States-Mexico border, or situations in the Mediterranean, or perhaps refugee camps in different parts of Africa and the Middle East, where the numbers of unaccompanied and separated children are much higher. And that's fair, because comparatively, Canada sees a lot fewer unaccompanied and separated children than other regions in the world. But I think you know, that's due partially to our geography. Canada is a very difficult place to access for refugee and migrant children who are fleeing and looking to settle elsewhere, and partially due to our policies, right? Canada is a very difficult place to gain entry to. And for children to come to Canada, it's a very hard journey to make with a lot of barriers along the way. So for those reasons, the numbers we do see are smaller than other regions through the world. But I think it's important to acknowledge that refugee and migrant children are coming to Canada unaccompanied and separated every year. And we'll get into the numbers in a moment on that. Another thing to mention would be that there's no one pathway for unaccompanied and separated children who are coming to Canada. So we see them come and arrive a few different ways. One way would be through an airport or a land border, where they make a refugee claim as soon as they enter Canada upon arrival. But another common way that unaccompanied and separated children are coming to Canada are access under a different status, whether that's a student visa or a visitor visa. And then if they are going forward with a refugee claim, they're making that claim after they've already gained entry into Canada, okay? And what we've seen over the past few years in Ontario is that the unaccompanied and separated children that we are able to kind of follow and track statistics on tend to be older. So the vast majority are the 15, 16, 17-year-olds. Very rarely will we see a younger child arrive unaccompanied, although on occasion that does happen as well. And another thing that's really important is the majority of these children that we're seeing are proceeding with an inland claim after arriving on under a different status. So most unaccompanied and separated children coming to Canada over the past few years, we've seen far more evidence that they're coming with a student visa or a visitor's visa and then making an inland claim afterwards, as opposed to making a claim immediately upon entry into Canada. Although there are those cases as well. So here's a little chart. Sorry, it's a lot of numbers and might be a little confusing, but I'll just walk you through it just to give you a picture on the number of unaccompanied and separated children that we are seeing enter Canada. And these are numbers leading up to the pandemic, so 2017 to 2019. So if you look on the column on the left, what you'll see is the years, 2017, 18, 19, and then a grand total at the bottom. And then you'll see the different regions in Canada where the Immigration and Refugee Board operate. I want to draw your attention first to the far right column, and that's the national number of what the IRB calls unaccompanied minor refugee claimants making a refugee claim. So the national number, you'll see, hovers between, around 400 a year, right? 476 refugee claims by unaccompanied children in 2017, then it dropped to 336 in 2018, and then back up to 450 in 2019. So what we're really seeing is about 400 unaccompanied children making refugees claims in Canada each year. And if you look in the central region, which is Ontario, minus Ottawa, I believe. So it's all of Ontario except Eastern Ontario. What you see is the numbers have been pretty consistent, right? Between 170 to 200 refugee claims made by unaccompanied children each year. And the way we like to look at it, just to put it into perspective, is that's about 3 to 4 refugee claims per week in Ontario made by unaccompanied children, okay? And I think that's important because it shows you that while the numbers are not as high as other regions throughout the world, these children do exist and they continue to come to Canada seeking protection. And so we have a responsibility to make sure that they are provided with the support they need to move forward with their settlement. So if there's one takeaway from today's presentation, as we focus on the context and approach of working with refugee and migrant children, I think it would probably be this. What we see as a fundamental challenge for supporting refugee and migrant children in Ontario and throughout Canada is that they're navigating immigration systems and processes that weren't designed with them in mind, right? Our immigration system was largely designed for adults, or insofar as children do move through those proceedings, they were designed for children who are accompanied by adults or caregivers. So when children are going through these processes on their own, it's a really big challenge to make sure that they are receiving all of the information, support, assistance, and access to justice that they should be entitled to, right? And I think because they're navigating an immigration system that wasn't necessarily designed for children or to be responsive to the particular needs and circumstances of unaccompanied and separated children, children are at specific risk when they navigate these systems. And there's two specific risks that I want to quickly point out. The first one is invisibility, which is defined as a failure to consider a child as a refugee in her own right. And I think that there are a couple ways that the risk of invisibility plays out. When you're talking about unaccompanied and separated children, what that can mean is that children are never identified and provided the support they need up front. And remember, we talked about children, most children entering under a different status, like a visitor or a student. And so if they're entering under that status and they are not moving forward right away with a refugee claim or another immigration process, there is a real risk that they are off the radar and that we don't know if they are getting the support that they need to effectively move forward with their immigration and their settlement, right? So that's one form of invisibility. More than that, and I think more commonly, another form of invisibility happens a lot with accompanied children who are here with their parents. And I think when families are making a refugee claim, often children are seen as appendages on their parents' refugee claim. And sometimes children aren't considered as refugee claimants in their own right. They are just attached to their parents' refugee claim, and they kind of just are along for the ride as the claim moves forward. Sometimes that can make sense, right? I think if there's a claim for protection that is really centered on a parent or parents facing risk of persecution, that makes sense, and they chose to come with their parents to Canada. But sometimes I think there are cases where the child may have an independent claim to protection. There are specific risks that that child faces back home. And when that happens, it's really important, I think, that that child's risk is pointed out, that it's emphasized, and that the child is seen and heard in the refugee claim process. And we don't always see that happening. Sometimes it is so focused on the parents' claim that we forget about the children being refugee claimants or migrants in their own right. And so that's a risk that we have to be aware of and hopefully work to improve when there are cases where children have independent claims to protection. The other issue, of course, is incorrect assessment, right? And that's a failure to interpret the Refugee Convention in a manner that takes into account the fact that an applicant is a child. When we are assessing through the refugee claim process or through different immigration processes, whether someone is worthy of protection, and we use the criteria that we use, we have to understand that what that looks like for a child may be very different than what it looks like for an adult, right? Subjective fear, which is one of the criterias that is looked at, looks very different for a 35-year-old than it does for a 5-year-old, right? Credibility looks very different for a 60-year-old as opposed to a 16-year-old who's going through the process in the refugee claim hearing. So I think it's really important that we move towards a place where we are always taking into account what the criteria may look like when it is a child who is moving forward with a refugee claim or with an immigration application as opposed to an adult. And so just to close off on today's presentation, I think it's important, as we talk about refugee children, that they really occupy a unique position in international law and in domestic law, because they really do stand in a place that is an intersection on the Convention of the Rights of the Child, their rights that they should be afforded as children, and the UN Refugee Convention, right? The rights that they should be afforded as refugees. So in Canada, as we approach this work and as we support refugee and migrant children, we really need to keep examining if all of the procedures and protocols and specific measures that have been put in place are sufficient to ensure their access to justice and their rights as both children and as refugees, right? That's important. And I think that whatever system we're working in, whether it's the immigration system, the education system, the child welfare system, the settlement sector, we need to really keep in mind that these children need to be respected as rights holders, both as refugees and as children. This is kind of where we'll close off for today. And then certainly if there are questions or discussion to have, I'd be happy to have that because we're going to touch on a lot of these actual issues in part 2 of this workshop next week. But I think it's important, when you're working with unaccompanied and separated children, to recognize that there are a lot of different settlement needs that these children have, and that it's really important to take a holistic and integrated approach to supporting children, right? Access to justice is certainly one of them, right? Whether they're navigating the refugee claim process or different immigration proceedings, or they're kind of moving forward with their settlement and applying for permanent residency or looking towards family reunification. These are very important, and there really needs to be legal and settlement support from arrival to resolution when you're working with unaccompanied and separated children through these legal and immigration processes. But of course, there are also other areas of settlement that are really important: basic needs and income security, appropriate shelter and housing accommodations, access to education and healthcare, as well as social connections and supportive relationships as the children continue with their development and move towards adulthood. So these are all areas that are priorities. And what I can say, and what we hope to get into next week, is that each one of these priorities has barriers attached to it when it comes to working with unaccompanied and separated children. Some of those barriers are applied to all refugee and migrants because of immigration status or other barriers like that. But some are very specific to children. And there are certain barriers and challenges that come up when you are working with unaccompanied and separated children that are unique to them. And next week, we really hope to dive into some of these issues and to discuss kind of, how to respond when those barriers and challenges come up. So I'd like to, at this point, thank you for attending today's presentation. Certainly, just looking forward to the next session, you can see some of the specific issues that we'll look at addressing in part 2, best interests of the child, immigration and legal needs, the role and responsibilities of designated representatives, which play a very unique and important role for unaccompanied and separated children in the immigration process, refugee children in the child welfare system, some of the other settlement priorities like housing, basic needs, and access to education. And also we'll be sure to emphasize some of the available services and resources that are available to refugee and migrant children in Ontario. So with that, I will end the presentation, and I believe I'm going to pass it to Natasha at this point.
I'm here, so thank you so much. I actually just wanted to read out, there was one question that came in, and the question is, what happens with unaccompanied minors who arrive at the border and do not have family connections here? Where do they go?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's a good question. Some of you who work in settlement and immigration, you may know that if we're talking about the border and crossing in from the United States, there is a safe third country agreement that prohibits a lot of refugee claimants and asylum seekers from crossing at a port of entry into Canada. Interestingly, unaccompanied minors, as our immigration system still calls them, but unaccompanied and separated children, do have an exemption to the Safe Third Country Agreement. So unaccompanied children are permitted to cross at a port of entry if they do not have a parent in either the United States or Canada. What happens to them? Largely, actually partially depends on the age of the child, believe it or not. Those of you who work in the child welfare system know that a few years ago, there was an age change, right? For many years in Ontario, if you were not under 16, so if you were 16 or 17, you actually didn't have access to the child welfare system the same way that that younger children under 16 would have. But a few years ago, there was a change so that all children under 18 have access to services and supports from Ontario's child welfare system. That said, we still do see discrepancies between younger children who are under 16 and what happens to them, and older children who may be 16 or 17 crossing the border, which is again a large proportion of unaccompanied and separated children that we're seeing in Canada. If they're younger, it's very likely that there's going to be intervention from the local child welfare agency, and those children will be assessed and taken into care, right? Appropriate care if there's no family member available to support them. If they're older, 16 or 17, it's possible. However, there has to be a child protection issue identified. So what ends up happening for a lot of older children that end up coming to Ontario, 16 and 17-year-olds, they may not be taken into care, or there may not be intervention with the child welfare system. Instead, they may end up at a refugee house or a youth shelter. Or many unaccompanied and separated children who are 16 and 17, they end up with community members and community connections as well. So we see that these children end up in a lot of different circumstances. There's no kind of one pathway for them when they are arriving and making a refugee claim in Canada, but age is certainly a factor. And then also, who they are connected with, or if they have any connections, even if it's not family, can also play a role in how they move forward. But it is not uncommon for 16 and 17-year-olds to end up at a refugee house or in some sort of transitional housing with an NGO or at a youth shelter.
That's fantastic, Steve. It really is. It's such a thrill to always to hear you present and share your experience with us. Every time I hear you speak, I learn something new, and I'm sure that that's a sentiment echoed by everybody who's had the privilege of listening to you today. So a big thank you, of course, to Steve for sharing his information with us. The contact information is here. Steve is very responsive. So if you do have any more one-on-one questions, I would really encourage you to reach out and ask for that support and guidance. As Steve said, part 2 is next week, so we'll really look forward to seeing all of you there. And thank you again for joining us today.